sharing this time with you today, and would like to thank you for joining us live from the Museum of the Rockies. I'm Jamie Oggs, the Outreach Program Manager, and will be your MC for today's educational adventure. I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter, Michael Fox, Museum of the Rockies Curator of History. Our friends and partners at the Live Learning Network are also on hand today to assist us with any IT needs. If you run into any issues, please type those in the chat box as we go. So right now you should be able to hear me and see me, and if not, again, type that in the chat box. Feel free to use that chat box at any point throughout today's program to ask any questions you might have or to answer questions we might ask you. If we're not able to respond to questions immediately, we will leave some time at the end of the program to get those questions answered. Before Michael begins, we're going to spend just a few minutes taking a closer look at where we are today. While she's getting that booted up, I want to say hello to our folks in Daniel Point, Ralph, Mary, Linda, Peggy, and Eleanor. We hope you're having a fantastic day. All right, there we are on your screen, about 80 miles north of Yellowstone National Park and 315 miles south of Canada. We are nestled in the beautiful and historic Gallatin Valley, right next to Montana State University. All right, there we are. There's the entrance. It's a little greener than what we're experiencing right now. We'll see that in a couple of months, hopefully. Next one, there's our History Hall. And then where we are today is pretty much directly below our History Hall. From here, I'm going to turn it over to our history curator, Michael Fox. Thanks again for joining us.
Well, hello there. Again, my name is Michael Fox. I'm the curator of history here at the Museum of the Rockies, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the history of a very historic town here in Montana. It's called Butte, Montana, and I wonder if you can pull up the map there that gives you kind of an idea of where we're coming from. And as you can see, there's a Museum of the Rockies there with a big pin on it, and if you look just a little bit to the west or to your left there, you'll see the town of Butte, B-U-T-T-E. And if you're familiar with the city of Butte at all, you're probably most familiar with its history as a copper mining town. And it was indeed a huge copper mining town, and it's still a town today. It's not a ghost town or anything. Not producing a lot of copper these days, however. The town itself, though, the basis of that town goes all the way back to really the first mining boom here in what's now the state of Montana. Back in those days, it was actually part of Idaho. And before that, it was actually part of Washington State. So we've come a long way, and our state has really been defined very much by the mineral booms that happened here in the 1860s. Our first big mineral boom was a big gold rush, 1862 in Bannock, Montana, and that rapidly moved over to Virginia City, Montana. And by this time, about 1863, 4, 5, miners were spreading out from these two gold rush towns to see if they could strike a mother lode somewhere else. They rapidly ran into one over in Helena, Montana, and then this area that we know today as Butte is located just south of there. And by the mid-1860s, there were miners, crawling all over this area. Really, the first place that they stopped was an area that became a town called Silver Bow City. There was nothing at Butte at that time. It was just a minor mining camp there, and it was really Silver Bow City that became the big mining spot. And by about 1866 or so, there were 350 to 400 miners there. Now, within just a couple of years of that, the whole entire Euro-American population of what's now Montana consisted of about 28,000 people. So it's 28,000 people spread over this huge, gigantic area. but most of them were clustered in little towns, again, like Bannock, like Virginia City, and Silver Bow City. Silver Bow City was discovered about 1864 or so by a couple of miners who struck some pay dirt there. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the types of mining that were going on at that time. Essentially what happened was these miners were overlooking the area where their claim was located from a hill, and they looked down and saw Silver Bow Creek, a beautiful little silver colored creek, and they said the bows and curves of the creek itself reminded them of silver bows. So this became Silver Bow City. Now the type of mining that's going on here, and most of the early mining in Montana and Montana Territory, it's called placer mining. Now this is a classic old-time mining. You might imagine that early gold prospectors are doing. It's like with a mining pan, much like this one from our collection. And miners would put what they thought would be good sand or various types of soils in this. They'd be down next to a creek and they'd swirl it around like this. The gold or silver particles are heavier than a lot of the other rock, and so they could separate them out through this means. If they found something that was worth panning more of, they would continue using this method, or they might use something like this. And this is a model of a gold miner's rocker, and it rocks both in this direction here and this way as well. And again, this is a model. A real one could be 8 to 10 feet long, and operated by several miners, dumping shovels full of dirt into the top of this thing, and again, washing it with water. Water is a critical part of separating out the minerals. So Silver Bow Creek was definitely a going concern. And at the same time, there were a few miners working around Butte. Now the miners in Butte, they were looking for, again, silver and gold were the main things that they were looking for. And the areas are along Silver Bow Creek, and Silver Bow Creek runs right by Butte, seem to have better deposits in the area downstream from where Butte was. Really what the miners were finding in the area of Butte were what they call black quartz reefs, or basically little projections of big pieces of a black quartz-like rock. And this is actually a really good thing to try and find. California gold miners had found that their best gold strikes were along huge quartz deposits. So this was a very exciting thing for these miners, but they couldn't really find very much directly on the surface. And what they did find were minerals that were mixed in with other types of rock. They were finding both gold and silver. However, it was mixed into a mineral matrix. And these were what we call refractionary ores. Refractionary because it means it's difficult to separate out the minerals that you want, the gold and silver, from the slag, from the stuff that you don't want. And this was really kind of the downfall of the early Butte as a gold and silver mining area. Miners were trying it out, not having very much luck. And in fact, by the 1870, there were people who rode through Butte and said, this is a dead mining camp. However, the only people that seemed to be really doing much were a group of Chinese miners who were there basically reprocessing ores that had already been basically discarded by most Euro-American miners. It was too difficult to make a living there. So by about 1872, there were very few miners left in the Butte area. And through this area rode a guy named William Clark. Now, Clark was pretty well known across Montana. He ran several different types of businesses. He'd had a Meineke, and a couple of his pals had a significant strike up in Bannock. And Clark took his savings and went into a series of small businesses around this very new little territory. So a couple of the most important things that you could do in this series of mining camps would be freighting supplies, because the closest real city to this area is Salt Lake City, which is probably 450 miles south from here. So getting supplies up here was tricky and expensive. So Clark made a significant amount of money just through his freighting business. But he also did a stagecoach business, basically moving people and mail back and forth from places like Boise or Fort Benton, which is also in Montana, but is a steamboat stop. He had actually made enough money to actually start a small bank in the very tiny town of Deer Lodge back in those days. And on one of his trips back and forth between Deer Lodge and Helena, which would one day become the capital, he rode through Butte and just saw that there was nobody around. And thinking that there might be something that he could bring to this in terms of cash and in terms of technology to try and separate out these refractory ores, he purchased a number of mining claims, about 10 of them, including a couple of what would become some of the most important mine sites in world history. He bought these claims extremely cheaply because basically miners were leaving this area in droves, and brought in his own team of experts, that's basically assayers, people who could try and unlock the mystery of how to separate these different types of ores out. Now, Clark himself was not a guy that everybody exactly loved. He was definitely a genius at business, though, and he seemed to have kind of unlimited ambition in terms of going from one type of work to another. But he had few friends. He's said to have cold, penetrating eyes, but a very strong work ethic. One great quote from someone who knew him back in the early days of Butte was, he said of Clark, "His heart is frozen and his instincts are those of a fox. There's craft in his stereotyped smile and icicles in his handshake. He's about as magnetic as last year's bird's nest." Not the best light guy, but a very important man because he brought capital. He brought money into what was going to become a mining camp. And part of that was, again, building a mining mill. What this means is you're going away from placer mining. Placer mining, again, is kind of one guy or group of guys who are getting together to excavate ores and basically wash them with water. As you're going into the next step of significant mining, really on a more industrial scale, you're going into shaft mining. And this is where you're digging holes down into the ground to find these bodies of different types of ores. Now, of course, it doesn't matter how much ore or how valuable the ore is unless you can extract the mineral from it, whether that's silver or gold. And in this particular case, they started finding some copper as well. So it is much more cash intensive. Basically, one or two guys can't do it. You've got to have a backer who's bringing the cash into the area. So another guy who showed up on the scene a little bit later was a guy named Marcus Daly, an Irishman, directly over here from Ireland. But he had the backing of a group of brothers from Salt Lake City who had sent him up to Butte to look at this mining situation. Is there something that everyone else has overlooked that we can take advantage of? Now, the brothers he was working with already owned a significant silver mine in Utah, and took Marcus Daly's word for whether this was going to be an economic possibility or not. Now, Daly had previous experience over on the Comstock lode over in Nevada, a huge silver mining operation there, and he'd been the superintendent. And unlike Clark, who was basically just a money man, he was the guy who came in and paid for all the workers to do the work. Marcus Daly himself had actually worked underground pretty extensively. He knew about underground blasting and timbering, which is putting up the big wooden platforms underground to keep the ceiling from caving in. He knew what a good ore body looked like and was much more of a hands-on manager than William Clark would ever be. He was also really a family man, got along with all of his workers, like to kick back and have a beer in the saloon at the end of the day, and much better liked, I would say, than William Clark ever was. He was outgoing and kind of gregarious. He was the kind of guy who was a friend of Mark Twain back when they were both in Virginia City, in Nevada, and he advised the Walker brothers from Salt Lake City to actually move their entire silver mining mill up to Butte. Basically disassemble the whole thing, leave Utah in the dust, and really concentrate on what he thought was going to be a major gold and silver producer. After just a couple of years, Marcus Daly himself was underground during blasting, and a huge vein of copper opened up. And it was unlike any vein of copper that anyone had ever seen before. It turned out to be one of the world's largest. And he immediately told his workers and his investors that this was the big one. They had really struck it big this time. Not with silver, not with gold, but with copper. By this time, it's getting to be about 1881, 1882. But suddenly, the whole world of what Butte was all about completely changed. This became a huge gold rush town. But it wasn't a gold rush town in the way that individual miners came here to find their own mother lodes. It was huge numbers of miners coming to dig into the ground on Clark's and Daly's underground mine operations. Another guy who became one of the three copper kings, as they called him in Butte, was a guy by the name of Heinz, Augustus Heinz, and he was an immigrant from Germany. He came over, and rather than concentrate on buying up properties and starting his own variety of different milling operations, he started off with building a mill where he could work with some of the smaller operators other than Daly and Clark, and basically mill their ores and make cash that way. He also was well liked in the community. But the three of these guys, Heinz, Clark, and Daly, became what were the copper kings of the day. All three of them became really wealthy. Clark himself owned homes in several places on the East Coast, West Coast, and a huge, gigantic mansion that he built right in the middle of downtown Butte. So if we have the first image here. So by the late 1870s, early 1880s, Butte was definitely a significant town that was in the running to really become a major mover and shaker, a major player throughout the Rocky Mountain West. By the turn of the century, about 1900, in fact, this was such a huge area of production and had such a huge population, it was probably the largest city between Chicago and San Francisco. So extremely well known. By this time, 1883, the Northern Pacific Railroad came to town, which made it much easier to move ores from one area to another. In other words, you can go straight from the mine right to the mill, and then you can transport your gold or silver or copper directly to large manufacturing areas: San Francisco, Chicago, Seattle, Pittsburgh. So mining, again, continued to take off. The railroad also made it a lot easier for equipment to be hauled into the region, which was, of course, a critically important part of the activities from the business side of this. These miners and the people operating the mills really had to create new ways of separating ores out. The idea is, again, it doesn't matter how much ore you take out, if you can't economically separate it from the slag. So they're constantly trying to find new ways to make it more economical to mine and produce copper. Now, the timing of this was actually really interesting as well, because with guys like Thomas Edison and the creation of telephones, replacing telegraph wires, as well as electric machines, and all of these things require copper, lots of copper wire. And that was one of the main things that they were producing here in Butte. The scale was gigantic. And in the Butte mining district alone, in about 1910, they were pulling out about 284 million pounds of copper in 1 year. That same year, they took out an excess of 10 million ounces of silver and 37,000 ounces of gold. It didn't take long before people recognized this and started calling Butte the richest hill on earth. So who was it exactly that's doing all this digging? We know Marcus Daly and William Clark. They're sitting in their fancy offices in their beautiful buildings in Butte. If I get the next slide. But who's actually down here doing the work? Well, they are primarily immigrants. They come here from all over the world. Russia, England, Ireland, Scotland, Serbia, Finland, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Italy, Greece, Syria, Austria, the Netherlands. Chinese people were actually working in this town too. And if you remember, back in the early days when Clark came here, Chinese were the main part of the population. They still hung on despite the huge influx of miners from other places as well. At its peak, the top population of Butte was between about 95 and 110,000. And this would have been about 1917. I get the next slide. This was also the peak of production for these mines. So 1917 is about the year that they started producing the maximum output of copper from this mine. Both of these photographs, the previous one of the elevator and this underground shot here, are showing underground mining operations. And from this image you can see here, they're still using candle power down here for their lighting needs. This is probably about 1878, 1885 or so. And what's going on here is they're drilling holes into the wall that they will pack with dynamite or other types of explosives prior to setting off a blast and exposing a huge face full of copper. You can see behind them there those huge mining timbers, and that's a big part of the story as well. There's a tremendous amount of wood required for these operations for two reasons. One is they're using it underground, and those are huge timbers. So they're big hunks of timber, but they're also, most of this activity is operated by wood and later coal burning boilers of various types. A lot of steam involved in this, and as time goes on, they're using compressed air to operate underground drills. Look at the next photo. Until about the 19-teens, all of the underground mining operations were powered by mules, like the one in this photo here. Mules had a pretty unusual life in the mines. They were raised up until they were old enough to basically pull the heavy ore carts, like the ones you see here, and then they were taken down in the mine. Most of them never saw the light of day again. They lived the rest of their lives in an underground environment. This photograph is artificially lit, you can see, but the two miners there, those guys are wearing a type of oil-fueled miner's hat, lantern that's attached to a miner's hat, and I'll show you one of those here in a moment. But this was the main type of motive power that they used for moving ore between the mine face and the elevator, where they took it back up to the surface for processing. In the early teens, the other claim to fame that Butte had is it became known as the Gibraltar of Unionism. Now, all of these international miners here from all over the world, they're all working together for these various copper kings, the three main operators in Butte. And the work was extremely dangerous. 1892, there was a major underground mine fire in the St. Lawrence mine in Butte, where a number of men were killed in the fire, but actually more men were killed trying to fight the fire because it was so intensely hot down there that actually the granite inside the mine became superheated, and when they hit that with cold water, it all turned into steam and actually scalded a number of miners to death. These were the types of horrifying accidents that really brought safety to the forefront of a lot of miners who rather naturally came together to form a couple of the most important unions in American history. Probably the first major one was the Butte Miners Association, which went on to become the Western Association of Mines. And these early unions attracted miners from all over the American West. And most of the mining is really going on in the Rocky Mountains. So we're going from Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, down into New Mexico and Arizona even. We've got people who are mining copper, silver, gold, all of these things are involved in, actually it's the Western Federation of Miners. And the number of miners actually became a significant factor in the economics of mining in Butte, because really a strike by a significant number of miners, and so many of the miners were involved in the union that a strike could shut a mine down overnight. The owners of these mines really had to take the miners' concerns seriously. Things related to safety, and that going hand in hand with things like the 8-hour day. A lot of these miners are working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And that in itself would be something that would cause accidents because the miners are so exhausted and tired. And remember, these mines are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the miners actually struck for and fought for a more equitable way of being paid and of having a life outside of the mine. Into this kind of hotly contested union world came another union in about 1915. These are the International Workers of the World. This group was also widely known as the Wobblies. They had started in the logging camps of the Pacific Northwest and made their way to Butte as what they considered to be an industrial union. Basically, any type of workers would get together and basically fight for better conditions and better pay. However, the IWW was considerably more towards the left of the political spectrum than the Western Federation of Miners, and they actually fought each other in the streets of Butte over who would represent the workers in their negotiations with the big three of the Copper Kings. And the fights were bitter fights. Between about 1914 and 1920, the Montana National Guard actually had to come in and restore order in the streets of Butte on 6 different occasions. So these fights were, in fact, pretty serious. World War I was a major boom for the economy of Butte because, of course, they needed huge amounts of copper to fight this war. Whether it's the wires on a field telephone set or the cartridges for howitzer shells, tremendous amounts of copper were required. And remember that the war ended in 1918, and the peak of copper production in Butte was just the year before that. The years following the war, however, saw a decline in the price of copper and the United States' use of copper as well, as the Depression tended to set in. Butte had always had a pretty itinerant population, people coming, people going, people being hired, people being laid off. And there were significant layoffs of workers during the Depression era, and this immediately came to an end on December 7th, 1941, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Instantly, the United States was put on a war footing, and any workers who were working in the Butte mines were considered critical war workers. that meant that they were actually prohibited from joining the armed forces, and that made a lot of the miners angry because they wanted to go and fight overseas with their most of them newly adopted country, but they had to get a very special dispensation both from the company and from the U.S. government in order to do that. End of World War II, you're actually starting to see a significant decline in the value of the copper deposits. They have pretty well mined this area out, and the mines themselves were built almost right in the middle of the city of Butte. So the whole town was honeycombed with shafts and adits and different types of underground tunnels on many, many different levels. The depths that the actual mines went down to were almost to the 5,000 and 6,000 foot level. So numbers and numbers of levels and tunnels underneath the city. As the primary copper company that was operating in Butte by that time was called the Anaconda. They had basically purchased up almost all of the smaller independent mines. By this time, Anaconda was recognizing that the value of the ore bodies was declining, and they needed to find a cheaper way to move forward with their mining operations. So if you can skip ahead here a little bit. Skip to the one with the pit. And this is what we call the Berkeley Pit. And you can see off to the right there the city of Butte, and up on the hill there, those were the old shaft mines. And you can see still see the mining towers and the shaft houses up there. But this area here became the largest open pit mine in the United States. They started building it about 1953. And they actually started digging it right on top of one of the primary and historic miners' neighborhoods in town. Basically, they bought all the land up, they moved everybody out, and started digging. This made it much less expensive to dig the ore out, and it was a lot less dangerous as well. Everything's happening on the surface, but as the mine was completely mined out, it became a gigantic pit, and once the company stopped pumping water out of the pit, it started to fill up with water. And these are from naturally occurring springs. The problem was that these naturally occurring springs ran up against minerals that, when mixed with water, became highly acidic. And essentially, when Anaconda sold this mine to a couple of other investors, they rapidly found that they had purchased a gigantic acid pit. And to this day, this is a National Environmental Protection Agency Superfund site, as they try to figure out how to deal with the acidic qualities of the water. So by about 1883, mining even in the pit had stopped. And Anaconda basically moved on. By this time, Anaconda was a gigantic copper mining company, and they basically moved their activities down to South America, where they continued their copper mining operations. So what happened to the town? Still there, but there was, of course, a major outflow of people of the town, and it is, while certainly nothing like a ghost town, it is much more sparsely populated than it was before. Today, if you visit Butte, and I think we've got a couple of pictures of contemporary Butte here, you'll see the remains of what was, yeah, look at that one, this great copper camp. Right in the foreground here, you see a huge hoist operation that stands right on top of a huge copper mine. That's the mill and hoist house just there right behind it. And you can see how close this is to actually downtown. The huge hotel there, standing up, the brick building, is the Hotel Vineland, which is right in the middle of downtown Butte. Beyond into the distance here, you can see this is the Silverboat Valley, and this is actually somewhat of an agricultural area, and still home to large numbers of citizens. As I mentioned, the town site of Butte is heavily tunneled under, and they occasionally have difficulties with what is called subsidence, which means the tunnels underneath the buildings themselves start to collapse, bringing little parts of the building down with them. So you might wake up one morning and see you've got a crack on the side of your house, and it is dropped 3 to 4 inches into the ground. It's going to be an ongoing problem. There's not a whole lot they can do about that, but Butte still hangs on. It's one of our most important cities in Montana, tremendous history, and I hope I've been able to tell you a little bit about it today. We pulled out a couple of objects for you to take a look at that are kind of illustrative of Butte's history. And wanted to start off with a couple of underground mining implements. This is basically a candle lantern. As you can see, it's basically a candle that has a long point on it, almost a knife-like point, as well as this hook that hangs off here. The hook you would hang off the front of your miner's lantern, and this pick, you could actually punch this into a timber near where you're working to illuminate the wall where you're working. So not a lot of light coming out of this, but there are people who lived, they're almost their whole lives in the light of nothing but candles, especially those mules. An upgrade to that is the carbide lamp, and this also has a big point on the end of it, which you can pound into a timber, or has the hook on it. You can hook this onto your miner's helmet as well. The way the carbide lantern works is carbide sulfide, little rocks of it, they look like little gray rocks, go in this bottom reservoir here. You screw the top on and pour water in the top, and a chemical reaction happens here that creates acetylene. You can control the amount of acetylene coming out with a little gauge on here on the top, and then you strike this little wheel here that's on a flint, creates a spark, and will turn on your lamp. So there's just a little jet of flame coming off of here. Now, both those types of lamps could be attached to a miner's helmet. And this isn't much of a helmet, it's basically a canvas hat, probably better at keeping water off than anything else. But you can see on the top here, this is where you'd stick the hook for your cap lamp in. These were used pretty extensively right up until probably the 20s and 30s, when electric headlamps came into being. The elevators, critical parts of life underground. And you'd find a sign like this at pretty much every stop on your elevator trip up or down. And this is gives you the signal codes for the elevators. There are a series of bells at basically every level so that you can communicate if you're, at the 2,000 feet underground. You can communicate with the hoist operator up on the top by sending a series of different signals to tell them whether to take it up or down and to what level you want to go. So these having a working knowledge of these bells is critically important, particularly in an emergency when you have to clear out a large number of men out of a very small elevator. Another item that most miners would have been familiar with is this detonator box. and you're probably familiar with this from Wily Coyote cartoons or something like that. You basically pull the plunger up, push it down, and as you push the plunger down, it runs a little generator that sends a spark through these two bolts here, which will be attached to blasting caps underground. This will run up to 30 different fuses simultaneously. So what was the full production of Butte? Well, I pulled together a few figures here for production of the Butte mines overall. From 1880 to about 2005, they pulled about 10.6 million tons of copper out of it. Now, if you made just a cube, if you made that into a cube of copper, it would be about 3.5 football fields wide, 3.5 football fields deep, and 3.5 football fields high. So a gigantic amount of copper. And realize that a large percentage of this was made into copper wire. So huge production out of here. They took about 2.3 million tons of zinc, 1.8 million tons of manganese, 419,000 tons of lead, and 24,000 tons of silver. That, if you looked at that as a single block, it would be one block of silver, 42 by 42 by 42 feet, and 100 tons of gold, which would be a block about 25.5 feet by 25.5 by 25.5 feet. So a lot of mineral coming out of the ground here. So we're getting kind of close to the end of our time. I wonder if you have any questions for me.
Any questions you might have for Michael, type them into your chat box. We have about 7 minutes, a little less, to answer questions from you.
While you're doing that, I can tell you that really the international flavor of Butte was not unusual for mining towns. And you'll see a lot of that still in Butte today. There's a very strong Irish population. We have the oldest continuously operating Chinese restaurant in the United States. It's right up there in Butte. Every year we have a big folk festival, and we bring in folk musicians from all over the world, but we definitely feature our Irish dancers and Irish musicians. Always have some bagpipers out there playing on the street. They basically close down all of downtown and have some very large stages and presentation areas right up underneath the old copper mining frames. So it's really quite an exciting town. If you ever have the opportunity to stop by, you should definitely do it. And look for that folk festival. It's really something pretty special as well. And there are other elements of the town that really remind us of the broad variety of immigrants that came to the area. There's still a lot of Scandinavian names of people there, Russians, Irish people, huge Italian community there. Even during Prohibition, the company, Anaconda Company, would bring in train carloads of grapes from California because it was not against the law to make your own wine. You just couldn't sell it. And so that is exactly what a lot of the Italian families in Butte did during that time. They made and consumed large amounts of wine. In fact, the whole period of Prohibition was an interesting one in Butte, primarily because they basically just refused to accept it. It's pretty hard to have a hard-working mining community, men who are working 8 to 12-hour shifts underground, coming up and not having any kind of alcoholic beverages available. And in Butte, it really didn't work. There were basically speakeasies operating right through the entire Prohibition era. In 1926, Montana became the first state in the nation to abandon Prohibition, and the state of Montana simply stopped enforcing it. So you still had federal officers like the G-men, and later became the FBI, working to stop the flow of illegal liquor manufacturing and distribution. But the city of Butte did not enforce that. So the Butte police, they completely ignore it. They would take cases into city court for bootlegging, and the judge would simply throw it out. It was definitely a tough, rough and ready town, full of miners and really full of a lot of great history. So if you do have the opportunity to come out there, please do, and be sure to stop by Museum of the Rockies. Any questions coming up?
Michael, is the Berkeley pit still being mined actively today?
Not actively, no. Basically, there are a couple of companies that are responsible for dealing with the pollution that continues to go on there. And kind of incidentally, they pull out some copper as part of that operation, but they are no longer actively mining in the pit.
All right. We want to go ahead and thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure having you with us. We look forward to seeing you again in April. Join us May. We're in April. Join us in May to talk with our friend
Shane Doyle, Dr. Shane Doyle, a member of the Crow or Epsalaki tribe of Indians from over here in southeastern Montana. And he's going to be talking to you a little bit about a celebration that they have every third week in August. And it's called Crow Fair. They call it the TV capital of the world. It's a huge powwow and big get-together for all the families on the Crow Reservation, who also invite all of their other native friends from all over the United States to come and participate in powwows, in horse races, and rodeos. It's quite a good time. And Shane's just the guy to tell us all about that. So we'll see you next month.
Join us to learn more. Thanks again for coming. If you have any questions or feedback, go ahead and contact me, either through email, it's there on your screen, mlroutreach@montana.edu, or feel free to give me a call, 406-994-5257. We want to hear how we're doing and what we can offer in the future to engage you. Thanks a ton.
Thanks.